The wind, a blade of ice, sculpted the drifts, each gust a mournful exhalation across the vast, indifferent canvas of white. Snow, thick as a shroud, had fallen for days, attempting to bury the sins of men beneath a veneer of purity. But the land remembered. It held the chill of screams not yet faded, the phantom warmth of fires extinguished too soon. Here, where the sky wept frozen tears and the pines stood like skeletal sentinels, the world was a study in monochrome despair. A scar upon this desolate expanse, a jagged gash of scorched earth and blackened timbers, whispered of a violence so profound it had silenced even the forest creatures. Smoke, a pale ghost, still clung to the air, a stubborn testament to the inferno that had raged. Amidst this ruin, half submerged in a drift-stained crimson then frozen to a dark, brittle crust, lay a figure. A woman. Her name was Ilara. The cold had leached the life from her limbs, her breath a fragile mist against the encroaching frost. Her lashes, heavy with ice, fluttered, a tiny rebellion against the encroaching oblivion. Around her, the snow was a tomb, the silence a deafening eulogy. She was a broken doll tossed aside, a final, fading ember in a world consumed by winter's wrath. What had she been running from? Or to whom? The answer lay scattered in the frozen debris, in the tatters of her once fine dress, now stiff with blood and ice. A small, carved wooden bird, clutched in one frozen hand, was the only intact thing, a poignant relic of a life violently interrupted. The stillness was absolute, save for the relentless sigh of the wind. Then, a new sound. The crunch of snow beneath hooves, slow, deliberate. A horse, dark as a shadow against the white, materialized from the swirling flakes, its rider a silhouette of grim purpose. He was a man carved from the very wilderness he traversed, his face weathered by sun and hardship, his eyes the color of a winter sky, missing nothing. Cale. He saw the smoldering ruin first, his expression unreadable, a stoic mask honed by solitude. His gaze swept the desolation, cataloguing the horror with an unnerving calm. He had seen the work of men like this before. Too many times. His horse, sensing the death in the air, snorted uneasily, its warm breath pluming. He was about to turn away, to consign this place to the unforgiving memory of the wilds, when a flicker of movement, almost imperceptible, caught his eye. A slight disturbance in the snowdrift near the largest pyre. He dismounted, his movements fluid and economical, his worn leather chaps whispering against the silence. Each step was measured, cautious. He approached the drift, his hand resting near the worn stock of the rifle sheathed by his saddle. He saw the spill of dark hair first, then the curve of a shoulder, the faint, impossibly faint rise and fall of a chest. Breathing. Against all odds, against the biting cruelty of the elements and the savagery of men, she was breathing. He knelt, the cold seeping through his thick trousers. His gloved hand brushed the snow from her face. It was pale, etched with pain even in unconsciousness, but undeniably alive. A tremor, almost imperceptible, ran through her. Her lips, blue and cracked, parted with a soundless gasp. Cale looked back at the devastation, then down at the woman. The wind howled, a chorus of lament. He made his decision in the space of a heartbeat, a silent vow against the encroaching darkness. He gently, carefully, began to dig her out, his touch surprisingly tender for hands more accustomed to reins and iron. The silence stretched, broken only by his grunts of effort and the whisper of falling snow. What spark of defiance, what stubborn will to live, had clung to her in this frozen hell? And what mercy, or perhaps what burden, had led him to this precise spot, at this precise moment? The wilderness kept its secrets close, but sometimes it offered a sliver of grace, a fragile chance amidst the ruin. He worked, a solitary figure against a backdrop of immense loss, unaware that this act of rescue was the first thread in a tapestry that would bind their fates together, two souls adrift in a landscape that offered no easy solace, only the stark imperative to endure. The cold was a constant, biting companion, but within it, a flicker of warmth had been found. He carried her as one might carry a fragile, wounded bird, her slight weight a stark contrast to the heavy burden of survival that now rested on his shoulders. The journey to his makeshift shelter was a grim pilgrimage through a world leached of color and hope. Each step Cale took was a testament to a resilience born of long acquaintance with hardship. The snow bit at his exposed skin, the wind tore at his breath, but his pace remained steady, his focus unwavering. Elara remained a dead weight in his arms, her head lolling against his chest, her breath shallow, almost imperceptible. He could feel the iciness of her flesh even through his layers of wool and leather. The shelter was little more than a lean-to, cunningly built into the lee of a rock overhang, shielded from the worst of the wind by a thick stand of ancient pines. It was a Spartan existence, but it was sanctuary. He laid her gently on a bed of pine boughs covered with a thick buffalo robe, the scent of resin and old smoke filling the small space. For a long while, he simply watched her, his gaze intense, unblinking. He saw the fine lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes, the pallor of her skin, the slight tremor that still racked her frame. Who was she? What had brought her to that place of slaughter? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. His movements were deliberate as he built up the fire in the small stone pit, the flames slowly pushing back the oppressive cold, casting flickering shadows on the rough rock walls. He melted snow in a battered tin pot, the hiss and steam a small comfort in the vast silence. He had seen death in many forms, but the calculated cruelty of what he'd witnessed back at the settlement, that always left a colder chill. He examined her injuries with a practiced eye. A glancing blow to the head, already swelling beneath her matted hair. Cuts and bruises mottling her skin. Frost nip threatening her fingers and toes. He worked with a quiet efficiency, cleaning her wounds with water warmed by the fire, his touch surprisingly gentle. He found a small, intricately stitched pouch tied to a ribbon around her neck, hidden beneath her collar. He hesitated for only a moment before opening it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a miniature portrait, a man with kind eyes and a woman with a soft smile, a small child held between them. A family. Obliterated. The weight of it settled in the small shelter, heavier than the snow outside. He closed the pouch, tucking it back into place. Some griefs were too vast to be disturbed. As Elara drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness, fragments of memory, sharp and terrible, pierced through the fog. The smell of smoke, not the comforting aroma of a hearth, but acrid, choking. The screams, high and desperate. The glint of steel in firelight. Faces twisted with a terrifying malice, eyes devoid of humanity. The pursuers. Their forms were shadowy, indistinct in her delirium, but the terror they inspired was visceral, a cold dread that seeped into her bones. She would murmur, soft, broken sounds, pleas and whispers. No please? Daniel. Lily's names lost to the wind. Cale would sit by her, silent, offering sips of warm broth he'd made from dried meat and hoarded herbs. He spoke little, his presence a steady, anchoring force in her chaotic world. His words, when they came, were sparse, practical. Drink, rest safe now, each syllable carried the weight of unspoken assurance. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting light outside the shelter's narrow entrance and the rhythmic routine of survival. Cale hunted, trapped, tended the fire, his movements economical, his senses always alert. He moved through the snowbound forest like a phantom, a part of the wilderness itself. He would return with a brace of rabbits or a ptarmigan, the silence of his departure and arrival broken only by the soft crunch of snow. Elara slowly began to mend. The fever receded, leaving her weak but lucid. The terror in her eyes softened, replaced by a profound, hollow grief. She would stare into the flames for hours, the ghosts of her past dancing in the flickering light. The memory of her son, Daniel, his small hand clutching hers. Her husband, Thomas, his strong arms around her. Gone. All gone. The wooden bird, her son's last gift, lay beside her on the buffalo robe, a tangible link to a life that felt like a distant dream. She touched it often, her fingers tracing its smooth, worn contours. Cale never asked. He seemed to understand that some stories could only be told in silence, in the shared space of sorrow. He offered her sustenance, warmth, and the unspoken promise of protection. His stoicism was not coldness, she began to realize, but a shield against a world that had shown him little kindness. His empathy was in his actions, the way he banked the fire to last through the night, the extra blanket he draped over her, the careful way he avoided looking directly at the raw grief that was her constant companion. In this crucible of shared hardship, a fragile understanding began to form, unspoken, yet palpable. Two souls, scarred by loss, tethered by the thinnest thread of survival in an unforgiving land. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of shared breaths, the quiet rhythm of existence stripped to its barest essentials. The wilderness outside was a relentless adversary, but within the small shelter, a spark of human connection, however faint, had begun to glow. The thaw, when it came, was hesitant, a reluctant surrender of winter's dominion. Water dripped from the icicles clinging to the rock overhang, a rhythmic tattoo marking the slow turn of the season. With returning strength, Ilara's world expanded beyond the confines of the shelter. She watched Cale, his every action a lesson in survival. The way he read the snow for tracks, the subtle shifts in the wind that foretold a change in weather, the quiet patience with which he set his snares. He was a creature of the wild, as much a part of the landscape as the ancient pines and the weathered stones. He began to teach her, not with words, but by example. He would hand her a knife, gesturing towards a pile of kindling, or point out edible roots &d herbs as they ventured short distances from the shelter. Her hands, once accustomed to needlepoint and the gentle touch of her child's hair, grew calloused, learning the feel of rough bark and cold steel. The grief remained, a constant ache in her chest, but a new resolve was hardening within her. For Daniel. For Thomas. She would not let their memory be extinguished like a guttering candle. She would live. Cale fashioned a crude crutch for her still healing leg, and they began to move, leaving the temporary sanctuary behind. The world that opened up to them was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Towering peaks scraped a sky of impossible blue, their slopes scarred by ancient rockfalls. Rivers, still choked with ice in places, roared through deep canyons. Each day was a struggle. Food was scarce. The nights were still bone-chillingly cold. And the shadow of the pursuers, though unseen, lingered like a taint in the air. One evening, as they huddled around a small, smokeless fire, Cale broke his usual silence. "They will look," he said, his voice low, rough like stones grating together. Ilara met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "I know." He held out a small, meticulously carved wooden wolf, its form lean and alert. "This land. It knows survivors." He placed it in her palm. It was not a gift of sentiment, but a statement of fact, a recognition of the strength he saw in her. She closed her fingers around it, the wood smooth and cool. A new symbol, to place beside the bird. Her silence was her acceptance. A few days later, they found tracks. Not animal prints, but the clear, cruel impress of shod hooves and heavy boots. Too many of them. Heading in the direction of the pass Cale had intended to take. His face, usually an unreadable mask, tightened. He scouted ahead, leaving Ilara hidden in a dense thicket of willows. The wait was an agony of suspense, each snap of a twig, each rustle of leaves, a potential threat. He returned as silently as he had left, his expression grim. "Close," he said. Too close. They changed direction, heading higher into the mountains, into more treacherous, unforgiving terrain. The journey became a grueling test of endurance. Ilara's leg throbbed, her lungs burned in the thin air, but she pushed on, fueled by a desperate will and Cale's unwavering presence beside her. He shared his meager rations without comment, found shelter in impossible places, his knowledge of the mountains their only shield. One night, huddled in a shallow cave as a blizzard raged outside, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" He looked at her, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Why did you help me?" He tended the fire, adding a small piece of wood. The silence stretched, filled only with the howl of the wind. "Then, no one should die alone." In the cold his words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a profound, perhaps painful, personal history. She saw then the flicker of an old wound in his eyes, a shared understanding of loss that transcended words. Her own dialogue was changing, evolving from the whispered pleas of her initial trauma. "They took everything," she stated, her voice gaining a new, hard edge, no longer a victim's lament, but a survivor's ledger. "My son." He had a small bird, carved from pine. Cale nodded, his gaze distant. He understood the language of such tokens, the talismans against oblivion. The rising action was not just the physical journey, but the internal one. Elara was shedding her past self, the woman of softness and domesticity, and forging a new one in the crucible of the wilderness. The pursuers were a catalyst, their unseen menace pushing her towards a strength she hadn't known she possessed. And Cale, the stoic protector, was her silent guide, his quiet competence a steadying hand in the swirling chaos of her new reality. The alliance between them was growing, no longer just a matter of necessity, but a bond tempered by shared hardship and unspoken respect. The mountain path was steep, each step a victory. The air grew colder, thinner, as they ascended. The peaks around them were jagged teeth against a bruised twilight sky. Cale moved with an instinctual grace, his senses preternaturally sharp, but even he could not anticipate the treachery of the loose scree slope. It gave way with a sickening rumble, a cascade of rock and debris. Elara cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound, as she lost her footing. Cale reacted instantly, his arm shooting out, his hand clamping onto her wrist like a vice. For a heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the precipice, the chasm yawning below, a hungry mouth of shadows. His strength was immense, his grip unyielding. He pulled, grunting with the effort, muscles straining against the weight of her and the drag of the sliding rock. With a final, desperate heave, he hauled her back onto solid ground. They lay there, panting, hearts hammering against their ribs, the dust settling around them. Close, Cale rasped, his usual stoicism momentarily fractured by the near-fatal encounter. Elara could only nod, her throat tight with a mixture of terror and gratitude. The incident left them shaken, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. That night, the pursuers found them. They had crested a narrow ridge, hoping to find a defensible position for the night, when Cale suddenly froze. His head snapped up, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly. Down, he hissed, pushing Elara behind a jumble of boulders. Peering through a narrow gap, Elara saw them. For figures on horseback, silhouetted against the fading light, their forms bulky and menacing. They moved with a grim purpose, their faces obscured by shadow and distance, but their intent was unmistakable. The ruthless pursuers. No longer a faceless dread from her nightmares, but a tangible, immediate threat. Cale drew his rifle, the metallic click of the bolt loud in the sudden, heavy silence. His movements were swift, economical. "Stay," he commanded, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, but his eyes, when they met hers for a fleeting second, held a fierce, protective light. The confrontation was not a prolonged battle, but a brutal, desperate skirmish. The pursuers, spotting Cale, let out harsh shouts, their voices echoing eerily in the desolate landscape. A shot rang out, a whip-crack sound, and a chip of rock exploded near Cale's head. He didn't flinch, returning fire with deadly accuracy. One of the riders cried out, clutching his shoulder, and slumped forward in his saddle. Elara watched, her breath caught in her throat, a cold terror gripping her. This was not the abstract horror of the massacre, this was immediate, visceral. She saw the glint of their weapons, heard the thud of bullets striking stone. Cale moved like a phantom among the rocks, using the terrain to his advantage, his shots measured, precise. Another pursuer fell, his horse rearing in panic. But there were still two left, and they were closing in, dismounting, advancing on foot, their movements predatory. One of them, a large, brutish man, spotted Elara's hiding place. His lips curled into a cruel sneer as he raised his pistol. Time seemed to slow. Elara saw the dark muzzle of the gun, the glint of malice in the man's eyes. There was no time to think, only to act. Her hand closed around the small, carved wolf Cale had given her, then around a loose, jagged rock beside her. With a cry born of pure, primal instinct, a sound that was part rage, part terror, part a mother's fierce protectiveness for the memory of her child, she scrambled up, hurling the rock with all her might. It struck the pursuer on the side of the head. He staggered, his shot going wide, burying itself in the snowdrift beside her. The distraction was all Cale needed. A single, sharp report from his rifle, and the man crumpled, his sneer frozen on his face. The last pursuer, seeing his comrades fall, hesitated for a fatal second. Cale was on him in an instant, the fight devolving into a savage, close-quarters struggle. Ilara could hear the grunts, the thud of fists, the desperate sounds of men locked in mortal combat. Then, silence. Cale stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving, his rifle still clutched in his hand. He was bleeding from a cut on his arm, his face grimed with dust and gunpowder. He looked at Ilara, his expression unreadable. The immediate danger was over. But the cost was etched into the stillness of the mountain air, in the sprawled bodies of the pursuers, in the tremor that now ran through Ilara's limbs. She had faced death, and she had fought back. The woman who had cowered in the snowdrift was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone forged in the fires of loss and the ice of survival. Cale walked over to her, his gaze searching. He saw the rock still clutched in her hand, the fierce, wild light in her eyes. He simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. The wind picked up, whistling through the rocks, a mournful dirge for the fallen, and perhaps a sigh of relief for the survivors. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by their ragged breathing. The aftermath of the confrontation hung heavy in the thin mountain air, colder than the biting wind that whipped around the jagged peaks. Cale tended to his arm, his movements practiced and efficient, tearing a strip from his already worn shirt to bind the wound. Ilara watched him, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a strange, unsettling calm. The bodies of the pursuers lay sprawled on the blood-stained snow, stark reminders of the brutality they had faced and overcome. There were no words of triumph, no exultation in their victory. Only the grim reality of survival, the stark arithmetic of life and death. Cale methodically checked the fallen men, his face a mask of stoic resolve. He gathered their weapons, a few meager supplies. Waste was a sin in this unforgiving land. Ilara found herself staring at the man she had struck with the rock. His eyes were open, vacant, staring up at the indifferent sky. There was no satisfaction in his demise, only a hollow ache. She had taken a life, albeit to save her own, and the weight of it settled upon her, another layer to the grief she already carried. She thought of Daniel, of Thomas. This violence, this desperate struggle, was so far removed from the gentle life they had known. Yet, it was for them, for their memory, that she had found the strength to fight. Cale approached her, his shadow falling over her. He looked from her to the fallen pursuer, then back to her. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of something akin to understanding. "You did what was needed," he said, his voice low, cutting through the silence. It was not absolution, but an acknowledgement of the harsh necessities of their world. She nodded, unable to speak, the words caught in her throat. Her hand, still trembling, opened, revealing the smooth, carved wolf. She had dropped the rock. Cale's gaze lingered on the carving, then met hers. A silent communion passed between them, a recognition of the precipice they had stood upon, and the strength they had found, both separately and together. They did not linger. The mountains were no place for sentiment or prolonged mourning. They moved on, leaving the grim tableau behind, the wind already beginning to cover the tracks, to reclaim the fallen. The encounter had changed something between them. The unspoken bond, forged in shared hardship, had been tempered in the crucible of violence. It was no longer just the protector and the protected, the guide and the follower. They were allies, two solitary figures who had found an unexpected, powerful connection in the face of overwhelming adversity. Ilara's steps, though weary, were more assured. The crutch Cale had made was now more a staff, a symbol of her own burgeoning strength. Her gaze, once downcast with grief, now scanned the horizon, alert, watchful. She had learned the language of the wilderness, not just from Cale's tutelage, but from her own brutal immersion. Her dialogue, when she spoke, was no longer tentative. "We need water," she would state, or, "that way." "The game trails are fresher." Cale would listen, sometimes nodding in agreement, sometimes offering a different perspective, but always with a newfound respect. The silence between them remained, a comfortable tapestry woven with shared experiences and unspoken understanding. It was a silence that spoke of trust, of resilience, of a future yet unwritten. As they descended from the high peaks into a valley green with the promise of spring, a sense of cautious hope began to unfurl within Ilara. The world was still a dangerous place, the memory of the massacre a raw wound that would never fully heal. But she was alive. She had fought. She had endured. And she was not alone. Cale walked beside her, a steady, reassuring presence. His stoicism was no longer a wall, but a quiet strength that anchored her. He had saved her life, not once, but many times, and in doing so, had shown her how to save herself. What lay ahead, they did not know. Perhaps a place of safety, a community where they could rebuild. Perhaps more hardship, more trials. But they would face it together. The lone cowboy had found more than just a woman breathing in the snow. He had found a kindred spirit. And the woman who was thought to have died in the massacre had found more than just survival. She had found a reason to live, a new purpose forged in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. The wind whispered through the nascent leaves of the aspens, a sound of renewal, of fragile beginnings. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt the faint stirring of something that resembled peace. The sun, breaking through the clouds, cast their long shadows before them, two figures walking side by side into the vast, unknown landscape, their alliance forged in fire and ice, their spirits resilient, their future an open question. The valley opened before them, a verdant tapestry woven with wildflowers and the silver ribbon of a meandering river. The air was softer here, carrying the scent of damp earth and new growth, a stark contrast to the harsh, sterile heights they had left behind. For days, they walked in a companionable silence, the rhythm of their journey dictated by the sun and the needs of their bodies. The immediate threat of the pursuers had receded, leaving a space for contemplation, for the quiet settling of souls. Ilara found herself observing Cale with a new clarity. His connection to the natural world was profound, almost spiritual. He moved through it not as a conqueror but as a constituent part, his respect for its power and its fragility evident in every gesture. He taught her to identify the calls of different birds, to understand the subtle language of the forest floor, to see the beauty in the smallest, most overlooked details, the iridescence of a beetle's wing, the intricate pattern of lichen on a stone. In turn, he saw the transformation in her. The haunted, broken woman he had pulled from the snow was emerging as someone of quiet strength and profound resilience. Her grief was still there, a shadow in her eyes, but it no longer consumed her. It had become a part of her, a source of inner fortitude, a testament to the love she had lost and the life she was determined to honor. Her hands, once soft, were now capable, skilled in the tasks of survival. She could mend a tear in their worn clothing, tend a fire, even track small game with a surprising aptitude. One evening, as they sat by the river bank, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, Ilara spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I often wonder," she said, her gaze fixed on the flowing water, "if they watch us." Daniel. Thomas Cale, who had been sharpening his knife on a whetstone, paused. He looked out at the river, his expression thoughtful. "They are part of the wind," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Part of the river. Part of the stars." He gestured to the sky, where the first stars were beginning to prick the darkening canvas. "They are not gone. They are everywhere." His words, simple yet profound, offered a comfort that surprised her. It was not the conventional solace of a promised afterlife, but a deeper, more elemental connection, a sense of enduring presence within the vastness of the natural world. She reached into her pouch and drew out the small, carved wooden bird. She held it up, its silhouette stark against the fading light. "He loved birds," she whispered. "Daniel." "He always said they carried secrets on their wings." Cale nodded. He understood. He reached into his own worn satchel and produced the small wooden wolf he had carved for her in the mountains. He placed it gently beside her bird on the flat stone between them. Two small totems, symbols of loss and survival, of memory and hope. "The wolf watches," Cale said. "It protects. It endures." A new understanding bloomed between them, deeper than mere alliance. It was a kinship of spirits, two souls who had stared into the abyss and found in each other a reason to keep walking. their future was still an uncharted territory. There were no easy answers, no guarantees of safety or peace. The world remained a dangerous place, and the scars they carried, both visible and invisible, would always be a part of them. But as they sat there, by the murmuring river, under the vast, star-dusted sky, there was a sense of quiet purpose, a shared resolve. They were survivors, yes, but they were also something more. They were witnesses to each other's strength, guardians of each other's stories. The lone cowboy had given Elara back her life. And in saving her, perhaps he had also found a measure of salvation for himself, a balm for old wounds he rarely acknowledged. The woman presumed dead had not only found her breath in the snow but had rediscovered the fierce, unyielding pulse of life itself. Their journey was far from over. But now, they walked it together, their steps aligned, their silence no longer one of grief or caution, but of a profound, unspoken connection. What choices would you have made, faced with such desolation, such loss? When the world strips you bare, what core of resilience do you find within? The wilderness is a harsh teacher, but its lessons are enduring. It teaches that even in the deepest winter, the promise of spring remains. That even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit can find a way not just to survive, but to hope, to connect, and perhaps, to heal. Tell us below, what strength do you believe lies dormant, waiting for its moment to awaken? Share your thoughts in the comments.